So even though it's August, I have a ghost story to go with all the candy that's out right now. So my story tonight is about my mother and her ujigami, our family ancestors. What I tell you about my mother is true. What I tell you about her ujigami could be true. Here in the US, my mother is seen as an enabler. So many friends from home have contacted me over the years to tell me that she lets my sister and her useless friends get away with murder. Navigating the tensions and explosions in their relationship over the years, I've come to think that perhaps there's something bigger at work, something bigger happening between them, and that maybe this story started a long time ago. In Shinto, the religion of my mother's childhood, rituals connect the present with the ancestors. Kami are the spirits of Shinto, and ujigami are the family ancestors, usually tied to a particular place and community that exists within things around us, rocks, trees, or as Marie Kondo reminds us, the items in our home. Sometimes they are good, and sometimes they're not. In May 1945, my mother was 6 when the Great Yokohama Air Raid killed 8,000 people in a single morning. In 1 hour and 9 minutes, 42% of their city was reduced to rubble by B-29 bombers, dropping firebombs with time releases designed to also kill rescue workers and firefighters. These bombs didn't just explode. The thermite pellets scattered them and burned hot and lit people on fire. From ages 12 to 17, the path across Japan that my mother's life took while working to send money home to her family brought her through cities where 121,000 civilians had been lit on fire in campaigns like the carpet bombings that engulfed cities in firestorms. For many of these families, there was no one left to honor them, to connect them with this world. In Shinto, when someone is killed, to not be shown appreciation and gratitude through ritual is to run the risk of returning as angry spirits who seek revenge. Some of my mother's ancestors, her ujigami, are full of fire. Even before World War II, my mother lived in abject poverty and never saw a doctor until she married my father. She had almost no adult protectors in her life, and so whether it was the physical pain of untreated whooping cough or the psychic pain of a friend's death after they lost each other's grip while running for shelter during an air raid, she suffered alone or in the company of others equally alone, in that way that war unmoors community. And so I imagine that amidst the chaos, the spirits of her ancestors wrapped themselves around her, and they journeyed together from job to job and city to city. But remember, and to use today's language, the relationship with these spirits, well, it's complicated. 11 years after World War II ended, my 17-year-old mother, whose stutter was the haunting echo of explosions from her childhood, was a hostess in the bars of occupied Tokyo, dancing and flirting with the US soldiers, coaxing them to buy more and more drinks. On the dance floor, she used some combination of the few English phrases she knew. "You are so handsome," or "yes, please," or "you're so funny." She used these words to make a space for herself in a world that did not value her. She didn't care what the words meant or what he felt when she said them. They were all just part of the transaction. She used the language of the occupier because for her it was the key to getting more money. And while these lonely men from far away translated my mother's job into feelings of connection, she was in her head adding up her commission in Japanese. And that's how she met my father. My father, a 6-foot-tall former drill sergeant, was loud, hated men, and loved my mother. As a kid, we'd hear their familiar exchange. He'd boom, "That's why you lost the war." And she'd come right back at him from across the house, "I am still fighting." My father died 20 years ago, and the thing is, I think my mother and my ujigami are still doing their part to win the war. In the early 1960s, my parents got on an Army transport boat to California, and they drove 3,000 miles to Massachusetts, where they settled down where my father grew up. It's few thousand residents, mostly worked in small mill towns, and seemed to know each other from, back in the day. Having a mother who had survived war gave us a certain perspective, like most kids get in trouble for saying things like "damn" or "go to hell." But the phrase in my house that could never be said was, "I'm starving." My mother knew the difference between hunger and starvation, and in a rare insight into her childhood, she would tell us about going without food. One day, while walking back with an egg meant to be divided among her 5 family members, my mother, always with her head in the clouds, dropped it. Knowing that other kids in my small town were not hearing these kinds of stories from their mothers, knowing that they never felt the utter despair that could be produced by the sound of one dropped egg shattering an escape of a daydream taught us to mean what we say. And so I've spent my lifetime trying to mean what I say about my mother's life, to make sense of such destruction and poverty and survival, and my mother's seemingly endless ability to give. And amidst my years of studying and writing, the story that seems to have compelled my mother's life, that keeps finding its way back to me, reverberates from the trees and the rocks and the items in my mother's home. And it is a story of endings and the complicated nature of destruction, immigration, and vengeance. Just like my mother would never let us starve, she would also not let anyone go without. Since coming to this country, she has taken care of so many, cleaned homes, cut hair, dressed wounds, bathed bodies riddled with cancer, brought food to people's parents, hemmed and patched clothes, all those things that people didn't want to do, were too embarrassed to do, or were just delighted to have somebody else do. And this someone else could be my Asian mother, the perfect friend because she was the perfect other, the one that just a generation earlier would have been called a dirty Jap. But in the 1970s, she was so clever, so willing, so Asian. When it was done for others, it was the proper order of the world. When she does these things for my sister and her friends, it's enabling. By the 1990s, my father, whose factory had shut down, started to take his prescribed opioids like so many others in our little town. Hospice helped him to die with them just after his 64th birthday. My mother and my sister also worked in a factory, and soon enough, my mother moved from her daily dose of Percocet to Oxy, and my sister pretty much never worked again. Life spiraled out of familiarity in just one generation. And while my anthropologist, nonprofit grant writer mind can dish out explanations about neoliberalism's privatization of systems of control and the decimation of the working classes in service to a two-class system in the United States, at least in my small family, I wonder about my mother's Ujigami and their part in all of this, much more subtle than bombs' destruction. What have these hot-headed ancestors been up to all these years? My mother had little to bring with her when she came to this country: a suitcase, some kimonos, a few knickknacks, not a lot, but just enough to carry some of Japan with her, just enough for those Ujigami to nestle in and travel with her across the sea. And as my mother converted to Catholicism, learned to make apple pie, and got used to never hearing her name, Fumio, pronounced correctly, her Ujigami also went about their business of assimilating into the people and the items around us. And as they did, as my mother's Ujigami swirled through our home, my sister, with her hair-triggered temper, she became the time release on those incendiary bombs, and she became the bringer of pain with words hurled like the projectile thermite pellets, and she became the occupier of my mother's home. She will move people just like her onto the couches, and together they will keep taking, because their needs are born of the all-consuming destructive nature of the United States. My whole life, my mother has stared off into the distance, particularly in the quiet hours of the morning. And on days when her body aches because there are days before she can fill her prescriptions, you can feel the room filled with memories, and not just hers. So many untold stories, so many unfinished lives. And with every meal given from her plate to someone else, and with every dollar, every oxy handed over, I can feel my very angry ancestors reverberating from the dollars and the pills and the actions of my Asian immigrant mother. And these feelings make me wonder if these ancestors may still be fighting, and in their unhonored, angry, assimilated ways, maybe even winning.